This area is for senior leadership.
You need to leave. You need to leave. Good. Starting Monday, I lead it.
Part 1. The public wrong. The ballroom at the Meridian House Hotel had been built for people who believed glass walls made them transparent. Beneath the warm lights and polished brass fixtures, executives from the country's largest renewable energy firms gathered for the annual Horizon Impact Gala, a night meant to celebrate innovation and partnership. Dr. Naomi Ellis stood near the entrance holding a worn leather portfolio that contained the final notes from a 2-year acquisition review. Her dark green suit was simple, tailored, and practical, the kind of clothing chosen by someone who spent more time studying contracts than cameras. As a black woman who had spent 18 years building energy infrastructure projects across 3 states, Naomi knew exactly what she was walking into. She also knew she had every right to be there. The invitation in her hand carried her name, Dr. Naomi Ellis, incoming Chief Executive Officer, Ellison Ridge Energy Group. But before she could reach the reception desk, a man in a black tuxedo stepped between her and the registration table. "Mom, this area is for executives and invited principals," he said. Naomi looked at the badge clipped to his jacket. Grant Whitmore, Director of Corporate Relations. "I'm aware," she replied. "I'm here as an executive guest." Grant glanced at the tablet in his hand. "What company?" "Ellison Ridge." His expression changed slightly. Not confusion. Calculation. "Ellison Ridge sent a lot of vendors tonight," he said. "Really? The vendor entrance is around the corner." Naomi paused. For a moment, the sounds of the gala continued around her. Silverware touching plates, a string quartet adjusting between songs, the low hum of people discussing billion-dollar projects. She had spent years in boardrooms where people questioned her projections, challenged her engineering decisions, and demanded proof of ideas they accepted immediately from others. This felt different. Not because someone asked a question, because the question had already been answered in his mind. "I'm not a vendor," Naomi said. Grant offered a professional smile that never reached his eyes. "I understand. We just have a lot of confusion tonight. Security has been strict." Naomi looked toward the registration desk. "My name is on the executive list. Let me see your identification." She handed over her driver's license. Grant studied it longer than necessary. Then he looked back at her. "You're Dr. Ellis?" "Yes." "The consultant." The word hung between them. Naomi had heard it before, consultant. Advisor. Specialist, someone invited into the room to provide expertise but never assumed to own the table. "I'm the person listed on the invitation," she said. Before Grant could answer, a tall man with silver hair approached from the crowd. Charles Whitmore, CEO of Meridian Peak Holdings and the evening's keynote speaker, moved through the room with the confidence of someone who had never needed to explain why he belonged there. "Grant, what's the delay?" Grant lowered his voice. "We're sorting out a registration issue." Charles looked at Naomi, then at the portfolio in her hand. "Is there a problem?" Naomi recognized him immediately. Charles Whitmore had spent months negotiating with Ellison Ridge's board during the acquisition process. He had reviewed her reports. He had attended meetings where her name appeared on every major document. Yet his eyes carried no recognition. "I'm Dr. Naomi Ellis," she said. "I'm attending tonight's gala." Charles gave a polite nod. "Of course. We appreciate all of our partners." The sentence was smooth, empty. Grant stepped closer. "He's trying to enter through the executive line." Charles glanced at the crowd behind Naomi. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." Naomi felt the familiar pressure to make herself smaller, to explain more, to offer another credential, another achievement, another reason why she deserved a place that had already been assigned to her. She almost did. Then she remembered why she had come. No, not to convince strangers that she belonged, to observe the company she was about to lead. "Actually," Naomi said, opening her portfolio, "I think the misunderstanding is that you haven't reviewed tonight's updated ownership transition documents." Charles smiled faintly. "I'm sure whatever paperwork you have can be handled through our corporate office." Naomi closed the portfolio. A year earlier, that response might have made her angry. Tonight, it gave her information, because people revealed themselves most clearly when they thought no one important was watching. Grant motioned toward security. "Just until we verify everything." The guard approached slowly, uncomfortable with the situation but following instructions. Naomi looked around the room one more time. Several executives had noticed. A few looked away. One woman near the stage lowered her phone after taking a quick photo, unsure whether she had witnessed an awkward misunderstanding or something more serious. Naomi reached into her portfolio and removed the invitation. She placed it on the registration table. "Verify it," she said. Then she stepped aside. Not because she was leaving, because she wanted to see what they would do when they believed they still had control. Part 2. The Wrong Story Gans Authority. For 7 minutes, Dr. Naomi Ellis stood beside the registration table while the gala continued, pretending nothing unusual was happening. That was the strange thing about professional spaces built on reputation. Most people did not need to say anything cruel. They only needed to keep moving while someone else was quietly pushed outside the circle. Grant Whitmore had already changed the story. It was no longer, "A guest's name needs to be confirmed." Now it was, "A person is causing a disruption." Naomi noticed the difference in the language before she noticed the people watching. A young event coordinator approached Grant with a headset pressed against her ear. "Grant," the security team asked if we should move her away from the entrance. Her, not Dr. Ellis. Not the person whose acquisition documents had been reviewed by Meridian Peak's legal department for months. Her. Grant lowered his voice. "Let's avoid making this bigger than it needs to be." People almost smiled at that. People often used that sentence when they were the ones expanding the situation. "I'm still waiting for verification," Naomi said. Grant turned toward her. "And we're handling that." He was verifying it. His expression tightened slightly. "Our corporate office." "Which person?" A pause. It was brief, but Naomi caught it. Grant had expected resistance. He had not expected precision. "I don't think we need to turn this into an interrogation. I asked who is reviewing a document you're questioning." Charles Whitmore returned from speaking with several investors nearby. His voice remained calm, almost friendly. "Dr. Ellis, perhaps we should discuss this privately." Naomi looked at him. Charles seemed surprised by the question. "Because this is becoming uncomfortable." "For whom?" The question landed differently than she intended. Not aggressively, just honestly. Charles glanced around the room. Several executives had started paying attention. The gala was supposed to showcase Meridian Peak's commitment to leadership and innovation. A public disagreement near the entrance was becoming inconvenient. But inconvenience was not the same as injustice. "Dr. Ellis," Charles said, lowering his voice, "I'm sure you understand that these events involve sensitive guests. We have procedures." "Agree." That answer caught him off guard. Naomi opened her portfolio again. "Then follow the procedure." She placed a printed page on the table. It was the gala invitation list. Her name appeared near the top. Executive Leadership Reception, Naomi Ellis, incoming CEO, Ellison Ridge Energy Group. Grant glanced at it, then quickly looked away. "Anyone can print a document." Naomi studied him. "That's true." She took the paper back, and that's why organizations have verification systems. Coordinator looked between them. "Should I contact someone from Ellison Ridge?" Charles answered before Grant could. "That won't be necessary." Naomi noticed that. Not the words, the speed. He had answered too quickly. A person interested in solving a misunderstanding would welcome confirmation. A person worried about what confirmation might reveal would try to control the path toward it. "Actually," Naomi said, "I think it would be helpful." She removed her phone but did not make a call. Instead, she opened the calendar application. There was a meeting scheduled for the following morning. Ellison Ridge Transition Committee, final leadership handoff. Charles saw the screen. His expression changed for the first time. Not recognition, concern. But before he could ask, Grant stepped closer. "Dr. Ellis, we're going to need you to step away from the registration area while we sort this out." The sentence was carefully constructed. Not leave. Not "you're not invited." Just step away. A softer phrase for the same outcome. Naomi placed her phone back into her purse. "Are you removing me from the executive reception?" Grant hesitated. A question was specific. Specific questions created records. "I'm asking you to cooperate." Naomi nodded slowly. There it was. The shift. The issue was no longer whether she belonged. The issue was whether she would obey. A woman named Claire Bennett, a senior operations director from another energy firm, had been watching from several feet away. Naomi recognized her from industry meetings but had never spoken with her directly. Claire approached. "Grant, I saw the invitation." Everyone looked at her. Grant's face hardened slightly. "This is an internal matter." Claire glanced at the badge on Naomi's jacket. Then at the invitation. I'm not sure it is. For the first time that evening, someone had interrupted the assumption. Not with a speech. Not with anger. With a simple observation, Grant stepped back. We'll handle it. Claire did not move. Naomi noticed something important. Claire was not defending her because she knew who she was. She was defending her because she saw what was happening before the explanation arrived. That mattered. Because if the truth only mattered after power was revealed, then it was never really about the truth. A security supervisor finally returned from the back office holding a tablet. Mr. Whitmore? Charles turned. Yes? The supervisor looked uncomfortable. I need to confirm something about the guest record. Grant immediately walked toward him. What is it? The supervisor lowered his voice. But not enough. Her name isn't just on the list. A pause. She's listed as the principal representative for Ellison Ridge. Charles stared at him. Did not stop. The music continued. The servers continued, carrying trays through the crowd. But the explanation Charles had been waiting for was no longer moving in his direction. It was moving toward Naomi. And she was watching carefully, because the problem was no longer whether she'd be allowed inside. The problem was what they would do now that they realized who had been standing outside. Part 3. The irreversible line. Charles Whitmore had spent 26 years learning how to manage rooms. He knew when to raise his voice and when to lower it. He knew when a disagreement needed a handshake, when it needed a lawyer, and when it needed a private conversation behind a closed door. But he had never learned what to do when the person he underestimated was already the person who would decide what happened next. The security supervisor handed him the tablet. Mr. Whitmore, the guest record matches. Dr. Ellis is listed under the executive transition credentials. Charles looked at the screen. He read the name, then he read it again. Reads did not change. Naomi Ellis, incoming Chief Executive Officer, Ellison Ridge Energy Group. For a second, the expression on his face was not anger. It was calculation. He was searching backward through every conversation they had ever had. Every meeting, every email, every time her reports had appeared before him with her signature attached. Naomi watched that realization happen, not because she enjoyed it, because she needed to understand what kind of person Charles Whitmore was when the facts no longer favored him. Dr. Ellis, Charles finally said. The title came out differently this time, not warmer, more careful. Naomi noticed, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. The sentence was familiar, too familiar. She looked at the registration table where her invitation still rested. A misunderstanding usually happens when people lack information. Charles nodded slightly. Yeah, it's fair. But this situation involved information you already had. His eyes moved toward her. Naomi kept her voice calm. You reviewed the transition documents. Attended the executive calls. My name was on the acquisition timeline. Charles glanced toward Grant, just for a moment. But it was enough. Naomi saw the transfer of responsibility before anyone spoke. Grant saw it too. Mr. Whitmore, I was only following the security guidelines. Charles's jaw tightened. The question surprised Grant. A few minutes earlier, Grant had acted like he represented the organization. Now he looked like someone realizing he had been standing alone. I was informed there might be unauthorized access attempts tonight, Grant said. Whom? Naomi asked. Grant looked at her. Excuse me? Who informed you that I was an unauthorized access risk? Silence. It was not dramatic. No one gasped. No one dropped a glass. The room simply became a place where people were forced to hear a question they had hoped would disappear. Grant adjusted his jacket. I was making a judgment based on the circumstances. Naomi nodded. That's important. Charles looked uncomfortable. Dr. Ellis, perhaps we should not continue this conversation here. Again, private, contained, moved away from witnesses. Naomi understood the instinct. A private apology could fix embarrassment. A public record could create accountability. I agree that this conversation should be handled appropriately, she said. Charles relaxed slightly. Then she continued. But I also think we need to document what happened. The relaxation disappeared. Document? Yes. Naomi removed a small notebook from her portfolio, not her phone, not a recording device, a notebook. Something ordinary. Something she had carried through every negotiation since her first engineering project. She wrote the time, the location, the names of the people present. Grant watched. You're taking notes? I'm preserving details. The difference mattered. Because details were often the first things organizations lost when protecting themselves. Claire Bennett remained nearby. She looked at Naomi's notebook, then at Grant. I can confirm what I observed. Grant's expression changed. It involved. No, Claire said. I was a witness. The word made him uncomfortable. Naomi noticed that too. Witnesses changed the structure of a story. Without them, everything became memory. With them, it became an event. Charles stepped closer. Dr. Ellis, I want to apologize for the confusion. Naomi closed the notebook. I appreciate that. He seemed surprised. You do? Yes. She paused. But an apology does not answer the question. Charles waited. Why was I treated as a problem before anyone verified who I was? No one answered immediately, because the answer was complicated, and because simple explanations usually sounded worse when spoken aloud. Grant looked toward the ballroom entrance. I made a mistake. Naomi looked at him. Which part? He frowned. The assumption. That was one part. She glanced at the registration list. The second part was turning that assumption into an instruction, then turning the instruction into a security concern. Grant did not respond, because she was not accusing him of a feeling. She was describing a sequence with decisions, a sequence with consequences. Charles looked toward the stage where the gala program was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. Can we discuss this after the event? Naomi considered. This was the moment where she could reveal everything. She could announce her position. She could remind everyone in the room that tomorrow morning she would take control of Ellison Ridge's future partnership decisions, but she did not. Because that would answer the wrong question. The question was never whether she had enough power to force respect. The question was whether people offered respect before they knew she had power. I'll attend the event, Naomi said. Charles nodded carefully. And afterward? Afterward, she replied. I'll expect the incident report. That was when Charles understood. She was not trying to embarrass him. She was creating a record. A record that could not be rewritten as a misunderstanding between two executives. The gala continued. But the evening had crossed a line, because the people who had controlled the entrance now had to explain what happened on the other side of it. Part 4. Counterforce and Personal Cost. The applause started exactly when it was scheduled to start. That was what Naomi noticed first. Not the executives turning toward her. Not the conversations that lowered when she walked into the main ballroom. Not the sudden interest from people who had barely looked up 20 minutes earlier. The applause. Because it meant the gala could continue. The event had absorbed what happened at the entrance and decided, like many large organizations did, that the safest option was to keep moving. Naomi sat at the executive table near the stage while Charles Whitmore delivered his keynote address about leadership, innovation, and building a future where talent was recognized regardless of background. She listened. She took notes, not because she believed every word was false. That would have been easier. The harder truth was that some of it was probably sincere. Organizations were rarely built from one person's intentions. They were built from habits, incentives, fears, and the small decisions people made when they believed no one important was watching. The problem was that someone had been watching. Naomi. After the keynote, she stepped outside onto the hotel terrace. The evening air was cooler than the ballroom. Below her, traffic moved through the city in steady lines, each vehicle following rules nobody had to explain. She liked systems like that, not because they were perfect, because when something failed, you could usually trace where the failure began. Her phone vibrated. It was her younger brother, Marcus, she answered. You survived the fancy gala? Naomi smiled for the first time that evening. Barely. Bad? She leaned against the railing. No, just familiar. Marcus knew what that meant. And he had watched her spend years entering rooms where people expected her to prove she belonged before they considered what she could contribute. You want to talk about it? No. A short laugh came through the phone. You answered too fast. Naomi looked back through the glass doors at the ballroom. People were smiling again. Networking, trading business cards, performing confidence. I'm trying not to make tonight about me. That sounds like something you say when you're making it about everyone else. She smiled. Marcus had always been better at noticing what she avoided than what she said. I'm fine, she replied. You always say that when you're tired. I am tired, then admit that. Naomi was quiet. That was the part she struggled with. Not the work, not the confrontation, the cost afterward. People often imagine difficult moments ended when the person finally spoke up. They rarely saw what came next. The exhaustion of replaying conversations, the effort of staying measured when anger would have felt easier, and the responsibility of deciding whether to repair something or simply walk away. "I don't want tomorrow's meeting to be about embarrassing anyone," Naomi said. Marcus answered immediately. "Good." She raised an eyebrow. "Good? Yeah, because you never wanted revenge. You wanted the system to stop making the same mistake." Naomi looked down at the city. "Hey, that's the part I'm not sure about." "What?" "I don't know if this was one person making a bad choice or if this is how the organization works." That question stayed with her after the call ended, because it changed everything. A rude employee could be corrected. A broken system required something harder: evidence. Later that night, Naomi returned to her hotel room and opened her laptop. She did not search social media. She did not look for comments about the gala. Instead, she opened the transition documents. Ellison Ridge's acquisition of Meridian Peak's clean energy division was not just a financial transaction. It was the beginning of a cultural merger. Different leadership styles, different expectations, different histories. She reviewed the guest access policy for Meridian Peak events. Then she stopped. There was a section she had not noticed before. Executive guest verification exceptions require approval from corporate relations and event security. Naomi read it twice. The policy itself was not unusual, but beneath it was an approval code. The same code appeared on the incident log from the gala, except the approval time came before she had arrived. Naomi leaned closer to the screen. Someone had flagged her entry before anyone spoke to her, before Grant approached, before the question was asked. That changed the nature of the event. This was no longer just a misunderstanding. Someone had created a concern in advance. Her phone rang. It was Claire Bennett. Naomi hesitated before answering. "Hello, I hope I'm not calling too late." "It's fine." Claire paused. "Wanted to tell you something." Naomi waited. "I saw Grant check the guest list before he approached you." Naomi sat up. "Before?" "Yes." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Claire exhaled. "He wasn't trying to figure out who you were." He was looking for confirmation of something he already believed. The words settled heavily. Not because they surprised Naomi, because they confirmed the question she had been avoiding. She had walked into that gala thinking she might encounter a person's assumption. Now she had reason to believe she had encountered a process. "Why are you telling me this?" Naomi asked. Claire was quiet for a moment. "Because I've worked in this industry for 15 years. I've seen people apologize for mistakes they never investigated." Naomi looked at the laptop screen, the approval code, the timestamp, the beginning of a pattern. "Will you put that in writing?" Claire took a breath. "Yes." The answer came with a cost. Naomi knew that. People liked the idea of witnesses until witnesses became people with names, careers, and something to lose. "Thank you," Naomi said. After the call ended, Naomi remained at the desk. The gala incident had started with a question. Who was she? Now the question had changed. Who had already decided who she was before she arrived? And that was a question the transition committee could not ignore, because tomorrow's meeting was no longer about an awkward moment at a doorway. It was about whether the doorway had been built that way on purpose. Part 5. The Reversal or Deeper Problem. The transition meeting began at 8 a.m. next morning. No cameras, no gala decorations, no carefully arranged lighting, designed to make executives appear more confident than they felt. Just a conference room on the 22nd floor of Ellison Ridge's temporary headquarters, a long wooden table, printed reports, and people who could no longer hide behind the rhythm of an event. Naomi arrived early. She always did, not because she wanted people to notice, because arriving early gave her time to understand the room before the room tried to understand her. The conference room had been prepared for a standard leadership handoff. Financial summaries sat beside operational reports. Legal documents were stacked in organized folders. A screen displayed the acquisition timeline. Everything looked controlled, until Naomi placed one additional folder on the table. Charles Whitmore noticed it immediately. "What is that?" "An incident review request." The room changed, not dramatically. No one raised their voice. But people stopped turning pages. Grant Whitmore sat across the table, his expression guarded. Unlike the previous evening, he was no longer standing at an entrance controlling who came in. Today, he was answering questions. Charles looked toward Naomi. I thought we agreed this would be handled professionally. We are handling it professionally. Naomi opened the folder. Professionally means separating assumptions from facts. You're of Meridian Peak's legal team, Daniel Foster, adjusted his glasses. Dr. Ellis, before we proceed, are you alleging intentional misconduct? Naomi looked at him. No. That answer surprised several people. I'm asking whether the organization has a reliable way to determine when a decision is based on legitimate security concerns and when it is based on an assumption about a person. Daniel nodded slowly. That is a different question. It is the correct one. She placed 3 documents on the table. The first was the event guest list. The second was the security verification record. The third was the approval log. I reviewed the access process last night. Charles frowned. You reviewed internal records before becoming CEO? I reviewed transition materials that were already provided to me as part of my role. That distinction mattered. She had not reached into a system she did not control. She had examined information already available to her. Daniel looked at the documents. The approval timestamp. Yes, Naomi said. It predates your arrival. Naomi nodded. Someone flagged my entry before anyone spoke with me. Grant shifted in his chair. That doesn't prove why. No, Naomi said. It does not. She turned toward him, and that is exactly why we are here. The room remained quiet. Naomi continued. Record does not prove what you thought. It does not prove what I thought. It only proves what happened. That sentence changed the atmosphere more than any accusation could have. Because accusations invited defense. Facts required examination. Charles looked at Grant. Did you request a review of Dr. Ellis before the event? Grant hesitated. Preliminary review. Why? Grant looked uncomfortable. Because the guest list contained a large number of executives and outside partners. We were instructed to identify unusual access situations. Naomi leaned back slightly. Unusual, the word remained between them. Grant immediately responded. I mean unexpected. Was my attendance unexpected? No. Was my name unexpected? Grant looked down. No. Then what was unusual? He did not answer. And that was the first moment where the room understood the difference between a mistake and a pattern. A mistake could explain itself. A pattern usually needed protection. Charles looked at Naomi. I want to be clear. Are you suggesting Meridian Peak has a discriminatory screening process? Naomi considered the question carefully. I'm suggesting we should not jump from one incident to a conclusion. A few people looked surprised. She continued. I'm also suggesting we should not jump from one explanation to an excuse. Daniel reviewed the documents again. There may be additional records. Then preserve them, Naomi said. The instruction was immediate, not emotional operational. Daniel nodded. I'll issue a preservation request. Charles looked at her. You're asking for a formal review? Yes. Of an event where you were personally involved? Yes. Is that appropriate? Naomi met his eyes. That is why an independent review exists. For the first time, Charles had no immediate answer. Because Naomi was not using her new position to punish anyone. She was refusing to let her position replace the process. The meeting moved forward. IT security was asked to preserve access logs. Corporate relations was asked to provide communication records. Event security was instructed not to alter existing notes. Each step was ordinary. That was what made it powerful. The truth was not being rescued by a dramatic announcement. It was being protected by procedure. At the end of the meeting, Grant approached Naomi privately. I want to say something. She waited. I should have handled it differently. Naomi looked at him. That's true. He nodded, accepting the answer. I thought I was protecting the company. Naomi studied him. And did you ever consider you might be protecting the company from the wrong person? Grant had no response. Because that was the question he had avoided from the beginning. Not whether he had followed instructions, whether he had questioned where those instructions came from. Later that afternoon, the independent review team discovered something unexpected. The guest verification system had been modified 3 weeks before the gala, only a small change. A new risk category, a category that required additional screening for guests whose profiles did not match previous executive attendance patterns. No one had named race. No one had written a policy saying who belonged, but the system had learned a lesson from the people who designed it, and now Naomi had to find out who taught it. Part 6. The second problem in motion. The first mistake people made after a crisis was assuming the discovery of a problem was the same thing as solving it. Naomi had seen it happen before. A company found the uncomfortable email. The manager apologized. A new training session appeared on the calendar. Everyone said the right words. Then 6 months later, the same decision appeared wearing different clothing. That was why she was not satisfied when the review team found the modified screening category. It explained something. It did not explain everything. The independent review continued inside Meridian Peak's corporate systems while Naomi returned to the operational side of the transition. She had spent years building energy projects where a single overlooked detail could delay construction, increase costs, or put workers at risk. She approached organizational problems the same way. Find the pressure point, trace the failure, fix the design, not just the person touching the button. 3 days after the gala, Naomi visited Meridian Peak's Regional Operations Center outside Denver. The facility managed energy storage sites across the western grid, and unlike the polished offices downtown, this building showed the company's real personality. Concrete floors, maintenance schedules taped beside equipment rooms, technicians walking between control stations with coffee cups and safety helmets. Naomi liked places like this. They had fewer opportunities to pretend. She met with the operations team in a small conference room overlooking the monitoring floor. "Before we talk about leadership changes," she said, "I want to understand how decisions actually move here." A senior engineer named Marcus Cole pulled up several dashboards. "We have formal approval paths," Naomi nodded, "and informal ones." The room became slightly quieter. That was the question executives often avoided. Because companies did not only run on official procedures, they ran on habits. Who gets believed first? Who gets questioned longer? Who receives the benefit of uncertainty? In the tour, Naomi noticed something attached to a workstation near the security desk. A printed checklist, not unusual, except one section had handwritten notes beside it. Executive Visitor Verification. Naomi stopped. "Who maintains this?" A security coordinator named Elena Ruiz looked over. "I do. Can I ask about this section?" Elena walked closer. It was added after a few access issues. "What kind of issues?" "Mostly vendors using incorrect credentials." Naomi pointed to the wording. "This says profile inconsistency. What does that mean?" Elena frowned. "I'm not sure anymore." That answer bothered Naomi more than if Elena had given the wrong one. Because unclear systems were often where unfair decisions hid. "Who trained you to use this category?" Elena hesitated. "Grant's department sent the update." Naomi looked at her. "Did anyone explain what qualified as inconsistent?" Elena looked uncomfortable. "Did anyone tell you what evidence was required before applying it?" Another pause. "No." Naomi thanked her and continued the tour, but the conversation stayed with her. A policy without a definition was not a policy. It was permission. That afternoon, the review team delivered its preliminary findings. Naomi read the report alone. The modified screening category had been approved by corporate relations. The person who created it was not Grant. It was a process analyst named Laura Pierce who worked under Grant's department. The report did not accuse her of intentional discrimination. It stated something more complicated. The category had been created using historical attendance data. The system had identified patterns, but the patterns came from years of unequal access. The algorithm had learned from the company's past, and then it had quietly reproduced it. Naomi closed the report. This was the part many people struggled to understand. A system could produce unfair outcomes without anyone openly deciding to be unfair. But that did not remove responsibility. It only changed where responsibility lived. That evening, Naomi met Claire Bennett for coffee. Not at a luxury restaurant, a small neighborhood cafe near the operations center. A kind of place where people came in wearing work boots and carried conversations that did not need a public audience. Claire looked exhausted. "I almost didn't call you after the review started." "Why?" "Because I've worked with Meridian Peak for 11 years. Naomi stirred her coffee. And I knew people would say I was trying to damage the company." Naomi looked at her. "Were you?" "Ill." Claire shook her head. "No." "Then why would telling the truth damage it?" Claire looked down. "Because sometimes companies confuse protecting themselves with protecting their reputation." Naomi understood that. She had seen employees stay silent because they feared being labeled disloyal. She had seen leaders avoid hard conversations because admitting a problem felt like admitting failure. "What happens next?" Claire asked. Naomi thought about the question. A month ago, she would have answered differently. She might have said the company needed accountability. Now she knew accountability was only the beginning. We find out whether Meridian Peak wants a cleaner story, she said, or a better system. Next morning, the review team discovered another issue. The screening category had affected more than gala invitations. It had been used for executive facility access, partnership meetings, and external leadership visits. The gala was not the whole problem. It was simply the moment when the system had finally produced a result impossible to ignore. Naomi looked at the expanded report. The question had changed again. It was no longer, why was I stopped at the door? It was, how many doors had this system quietly closed before anyone noticed? Part 7, the Collision and Accountability Test. The review hearing was held 2 weeks later in a conference room that looked almost identical to the one where Naomi had first requested an investigation. Same long table, same glass walls, same careful arrangement of folders, but the atmosphere was different. Because this time nobody was pretending they were discussing a misunderstanding. The independent review panel sat at the front of the room. Representatives from compliance, human resources, corporate operations, and legal were present. Charles Whitmore sat on one side with Meridian Peak's leadership team. Naomi sat across from them. Not above them, not separated from them. Across, that distinction mattered. The purpose of the meeting was not to create a winner and a loser. It was to determine what happened, why it happened, and what responsibility followed. The lead reviewer, Andrea Morgan, opened the meeting. We are not evaluating intentions. We are evaluating decisions, controls, and outcomes. Naomi appreciated the wording. Intentions disappeared easily. Systems left records. Andrea displayed the first timeline. The executive guest screening adjustment was introduced 3 weeks before the Horizon Impact Gala. The stated purpose was to prevent unauthorized access after several credential incidents. A document appeared on the screen. The adjustment itself was approved through normal channels. Charles nodded slightly. That was the argument Meridian Peak had prepared. The policy was approved. Employees followed it. The process worked. But Andrea continued. The issue is that the category lacked objective criteria. The next slide appeared. Fall inconsistency, definition. Not retrieve no one spoke. Employees were instructed to identify unusual situations, Andrea said, but they were not given measurable standards for what qualified as unusual. Naomi looked around the table. This was the point where organizations often failed. They wanted employees to make judgments without admitting judgments were being made, Andrea continued. The review found that the category was applied unevenly. Another slide. Examples. Different treatment. Different levels of verification. Similar circumstances. The pattern was not built from one person's choice. It was built from hundreds of small choices that never received enough attention to be questioned. Grant Whitmore shifted in his seat. Andrea looked toward him. Mr. Whitmore, can you explain how corporate relations evaluated these cases? Grant took a breath. We were trying to protect executive spaces. From what I'll access, based on what criteria? He hesitated. He relied on staff judgment. Andrea nodded. And what guidance did staff receive for that judgment? Grant looked down. Not enough. The answer was quiet, but it mattered. Because for the first time he was not defending the system. He was describing its failure. Charles leaned forward. I want to make clear that Meridian Peak never created a policy based on race. Andrea turned toward him. That is correct. The room waited. But that does not conclude the review. Charles looked at her. Andrea continued. A system does not need to contain explicit language to produce unequal treatment. The question is whether the design creates predictable outcomes and whether leadership recognizes those outcomes. Naomi watched Charles absorb that. If he was not being accused of a personal belief, he was being asked to examine a structure he had allowed to exist. That was harder, because structures did not apologize. People did. They displayed the final evidence. The Gala incident record, the original entry request, the security notes, Claire Bennett's statement, approval history. Each piece itself was incomplete. Together they created a clear sequence. A decision was made. A person was classified as unusual. Classification influenced behavior. The behavior became a public incident. Naomi spoke for the first time. I want to address something. Andrea nodded. Naomi looked at the group. When this happened, it would have been easy to focus only on Grant. Grant looked up, she continued. He was the person standing at the door. He was the person who spoke to me. He made choices, and those choices matter. A pause. But if we remove one person and leave the system unchanged, someone will eventually stand in that same position. The room stayed quiet. Naomi did not continue with a prepared statement. She did not need to. The evidence had already done the work. Andrea asked, "What outcome are you requesting?" Naomi had thought about that question for days. She could have asked for public humiliation. She could have demanded immediate punishment. Instead, she opened the folder in front of her. "I'm requesting 3 things." She placed 3 pages on the table. First, an independent audit of access screening practices across all Meridian Peak facilities. A second page. Second, removal of undefined risk categories until objective standards are established. A third, protection for employees who report concerns about how these systems are applied. Charles looked at the documents. "You're not requesting termination?" No, the answer was immediate, because termination alone would solve the symptom, not the cause. He looked at her. That was the first time his expression showed something other than defensiveness. Not forgiveness, recognition. He understood she had the opportunity to destroy his career, and she had chosen something more difficult, accountability. The panel moved into private discussion. For the first time since the gala, Naomi allowed herself to lean back. Not because the outcome was guaranteed. And it was not. Organizations could agree with a principle and still resist the work required to live by it. 20 minutes later, Andrea returned. "We are approving the audit and immediate suspension of the screening category pending review. A measured decision. Not a dramatic collapse, not a public execution, a real consequence." Then Andrea added, "There is one additional matter." Naomi looked up. The audit team found that the category was not only used for event access. A new file appeared. Several leadership partnership meetings were reviewed using the same screening criteria. The room changed, because the problem had moved beyond a doorway. It had entered the places where opportunities were decided. Part 8, the decision and its cost. The announcement was not made at a press conference. Naomi had expected that. Real organizations rarely changed because someone found the perfect sentence for a camera. They changed because enough people with responsibility accepted that the old way could no longer continue. 3 days after the accountability review, Meridian Peak released an internal decision memorandum. The language was careful. It always was. Companies chose words the way engineers chose materials. Every sentence had a purpose. But the meaning was clear. The executive screening category was permanently removed. The independent audit would expand across all corporate access systems. Employees involved in creating or applying unclear screening practices would undergo review, and the partnership access process would be redesigned with measurable standards. The document did not say Meridian Peak had intentionally created discrimination. It did not need to. The findings described the impact, the process, the decisions. Responsibility, that was enough. Naomi read the announcement from her office at Ellison Ridge. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt tired. Not the kind of tired that came from long meetings or travel. The kind that came from carrying something heavy for too long and realizing that putting it down did not immediately make your body forget the weight. Her assistant, Jordan, placed a coffee beside her. "You've read that report 4 times. Naomi looked up. "Have I?" "Yes, that's concerning." Jordan smiled. "It would be if you were trying to memorize it." Naomi glanced back at the screen. "I'm trying to understand whether this is enough." Jordan leaned against the doorway. "Enough for what?" "That depends." On whether they changed because they believe it was wrong or because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't." Jordan considered that. "You may never know." Naomi nodded. That was the frustrating part of leadership. Not every decision came with a clean answer. Sometimes the best you could do was build structures where better choices became easier and harmful ones became harder. The consequences for those involved arrived over the next several weeks. Grant Whitmore was removed from his role, overseeing corporate access operations while the review continued. He was not fired immediately. The distinction mattered. The investigation found that he had made poor decisions and reinforced an unreliable process, but it did not find evidence that he personally designed the system with discriminatory intent. He was required to complete leadership review training, participate in policy redesign discussions, and remain outside access control decisions until the audit was complete. Some people criticized the decision. Others said it was too harsh. Naomi understood both reactions. Accountability was rarely satisfying when people expected either revenge or complete forgiveness. It was supposed to match responsibility, not emotion. The larger consequences reached Meridian Peak itself. The audit discovered 17 additional cases where the unclear screening category had delayed or complicated access for executives, partners, and candidates. Not all involved race. That was important. The system had created a broader problem. But the review also showed that certain groups experienced the burden more often. The company published a correction, not an apology written by a communications team. A correction. A statement acknowledging that the process had failed to define standards and had allowed personal assumptions to influence professional decisions. Claire Bennett read the statement from her office. Then she called Naomi. They included the employee reporting protections. Naomi smiled. Yes, didn't think they would. Neither did I. That surprised Claire. You didn't? No. Nay looked outside her window. I hoped they would. There was a difference. Hope allowed uncertainty. Expectation created disappointment. Claire was quiet. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why didn't you use your position that night? Naomi knew exactly what she meant. Why not announce who she was? Why not make Charles and Grant realize immediately that they had made a mistake? The answer had become clearer over time. Because if I had introduced myself as the incoming CEO, they might have corrected their behavior because of my title. And I needed to know whether the behavior changed because the assumption changed or because the person in front of them changed. Claire thought about that. That's a difficult distinction. It is. A week later, Naomi returned to the Meridian House Hotel. Not for a gala, for a leadership workshop. The entrance looked exactly the same polished floor, the same registration desk, the same brass lettering on the wall. But the access process had changed. The old category was gone. The new system required documented reasons for additional verification, no vague language. Invisible standards. No room for someone to decide that a person looked out of place without explaining why. A young event employee greeted Naomi. Good morning, Dr. Ellis. Naomi handed over her identification. The employee checked the system. Everything is confirmed. A simple sentence, the kind that should have been ordinary from the beginning. Naomi walked into the building. But before entering the conference room, she stopped. The doorway that had once represented a question now represented something else. Not a victory, a reminder. Because fixing one door did not mean every door was open. That afternoon, the audit team delivered its final recommendation. One section caught Naomi's attention. It was not about the gala. It was not about Grant. It was about the company's leadership pipeline. The same pattern of informal judgment had appeared in another area, promotion reviews. Different system, different consequences. The same question. Who gets seen as ready before they have to prove it? Naomi closed the report. The first battle had ended, but the next decision was already waiting. And this time, the door was not an entrance, it was a seat at the table. Part 9, Repair Under Pressure. The hardest part of repairing an organization was that nobody could point to the exact moment when repair was complete. There was no single signature. No final meeting where everyone stood up and agreed the past had been corrected. Change was measured in smaller things. The questions people asked, the decisions they challenged, the habits they stopped defending. 3 months after the Horizon Impact Gala, Naomi returned to Meridian Peak's headquarters for the final audit presentation. This time she entered through the same main doors. No hesitation, no additional verification, no unusual classification, just a normal arrival. And that normality mattered, because the goal was never for her to receive special treatment. The goal was for the system to stop requiring certain people to prove they belonged before others did. Inside the building, she noticed something different. Not the furniture, not the artwork, the conversations. Employees were discussing the audit openly. That alone told her something had changed. Before, people had spoken about the incident carefully, using phrases like the situation or the misunderstanding. Now they used specific language, the screening category, the approval process, the access review. Naming a problem did not solve it, but refusing to name it protected it. The audit team presented their final findings in the same conference room where the review had begun. Andrea Morgan stood at the front. The access control changes have been implemented across all Meridian Peak facilities. A slide appeared. Verification standards. Clear documentation requirements. Employee reporting protections. Independent quarterly reviews. Supervisors must now provide a specific operational reason for additional screening. Personal judgment without documented criteria is not considered sufficient. Naomi listened carefully. She had learned not to confuse announcements with outcomes. The real test would come months later, not today. A policy was only as strong as the behavior it created when nobody was watching. Andrea moved to the next section. The review also identified weaknesses beyond access control. The room became quieter. Promotion evaluation processes showed similar reliance on informal recommendations and subjective language. Naomi looked at the screen. There it was, the next door. Not the one people walked through, the one people competed behind. Words appeared. Leadership presence, cultural fit, executive readiness, terms that sounded professional, terms that could mean almost anything. Andrea continued. These criteria were not intentionally designed to exclude anyone. However, without measurable definitions, they created inconsistent evaluations. Naomi remembered the Gala entrance, the same pattern. A person was not openly told they did not belong. Instead, the organization created conditions where belonging had to be interpreted by someone else. After the presentation, Grant approached Naomi. It had been months since they had spoken privately. He looked different. Not transformed, just less certain. That was sometimes where change began. I wanted to thank you for something, he said. Naomi waited. Expected you to try to ruin me. She looked at him. That's what you would have done. He gave a small, uncomfortable smile. Maybe. The honesty surprised her. I don't know. Grant looked toward the conference room. When the review started, I kept thinking about whether I was a bad person. Naomi did not answer immediately, because she knew the danger of that question. It could become a way for people to focus on their identity instead of their actions. Finally, she said, that may not be the most useful question. Grant nodded. I know. He looked down. The more difficult question was why I trusted my assumption so quickly. That was different. Not a defense, an examination. Naomi accepted the difference. Did you find an answer? Partly. He paused. I thought I was protecting the company from risk. But I never asked whether I was creating risk by making decisions without enough information. Naomi nodded. That's the question leaders have to ask. Grant left after that. No dramatic reconciliation. No friendship. Some things did not return to what they were, and maybe they should not. The same week, Claire Bennett accepted a new role on Meridian Peak's Employee Review Committee. She told Naomi she almost declined. Why? Because I don't want to spend the rest of my career being the person who points out problems. Naomi understood. That's not your role. What is? Naomi smiled slightly. The person who helps build something better. Claire considered that. I'm still not sure I know how. Neither do most people. And that answer made Claire laugh. You're the CEO. Yes. And you're saying you don't know? I'm saying leadership is not knowing everything. It's creating a place where the right questions can survive. That evening, Naomi returned home and placed her gala invitation into a drawer. She had kept it the entire time, not as a trophy, not as proof that she had won, as a reminder. The paper itself had not changed. The ink was still the same. The name was still printed clearly. The difference was that people had finally learned to read what was already there. A month later, Ellison Ridge's board approved Naomi's first major leadership initiative after the transition. It was not a publicity campaign. It was not a symbolic appointment. It was a new evaluation framework for executive advancement across both companies. Clear standards, documented criteria, review panels with independent members. A system designed to make hidden assumptions harder to hide. Naomi signed the approval documents late that night. Then she looked at the old gala invitation one last time before placing it away. The moment that started everything had been a question at a doorway. But the answer was never just about who was allowed inside. It was about who had the power to decide that question in the first place, and whether they were willing to change. Part 10. The Last Consequence and Open Horizon. 6 months after the Horizon Impact Gala, Meridian Peak released the final results of its organizational review. Its report was not dramatic. There were no accusations designed for headlines, no public collapse, no single person carrying the entire weight of a system's failure. Instead, there were findings. Specific ones. The independent audit confirmed that the executive screening process had relied on unclear categories inconsistent standards, and subjective judgments that created unequal experiences for people entering Meridian Peak spaces. The access system was rebuilt. The undefined screening categories were removed permanently. Every additional verification request now required a documented operational reason, reviewable by compliance. Managers who made access decisions received updated training, but more importantly, received clearer limits on what they were allowed to decide. The company also created an independent review panel for leadership access and advancement decisions, not because every leader had bad intentions, because organizations needed structures that did not depend on every person having perfect judgment every day. Whitmore remained with Meridian Peak, but his role changed. He no longer oversaw corporate access operations. After completing the leadership review process, he moved into a compliance improvement role where his work focused on correcting the very systems he had once helped maintain. Naomi did not request that outcome. She had made that clear from the beginning. Consequences belonged to the people and processes with authority to determine them. Her responsibility was not to choose punishment. It was to make sure the facts were impossible to ignore. Charles Whitmore stepped away from his position as CEO of Meridian Peak 6 months after the acquisition transition was completed. The board described it as a planned leadership change. Naomi knew the truth was more complicated. Leaders rarely left because of one moment. They left because moments revealed decisions that had been accumulating for years. Charles had not created every problem inside Meridian Peak, but he had been responsible for the environment where those problems survived. The company moved forward under new leadership. Not perfectly, no organization did, but differently, and that difference mattered. 1 year after the gala, Naomi returned to the Meridian House Hotel. This time, she was not there for a transition meeting. She was there for a community leadership event hosted by Ellison Ridge. Young engineers, project managers, and university students filled the ballroom. Some were meeting executives for the first time. Some were trying to imagine themselves becoming executives someday. Naomi stood near the entrance before the event began. The same place where she had once been stopped, the same floor, the same doorway. But the feeling was different. A young woman wearing a university badge approached her. "Dr. Ellis," Naomi turned. "Yes." The student smiled nervously. "I wanted to say thank you." Naomi looked confused. "For what?" "Read about the access review." The student held a notebook against her chest. "I'm studying energy systems. Sometimes I walk into professional spaces and I wonder if people see me as someone who belongs there." Naomi understood that feeling. Not because every room was the same, because she remembered the cost of entering rooms where she had already been judged. "What do you do when you feel that way?" the student asked. Naomi looked across the ballroom. At the engineers, the organizers, the people preparing the next generation of work. She thought about the answer. For years, she had believed the goal was proving she belonged. Then she learned something harder. Belonging was not something other people granted, but systems could make it easier or harder for people to be recognized fairly. "You keep building," Naomi said. The student smiled. "Even when people don't see it yet, especially then." Later that evening, after the event ended, Naomi returned to her office. On her desk was the original gala invitation. She still kept it. Not because of the humiliation, not because of the moment when people finally realized who she was. The invitation represented something else. A reminder that the most important question was never, who has enough power to demand respect? The better question was, what kind of system makes respect the starting point instead of the reward? Naomi placed the invitation into a folder. Then she opened a new document on her computer. The title read, Leadership Access Review Phase 2. She smiled slightly. The first problem had been solved. The first door had been rebuilt. But leadership was never only about fixing the door you walked through. Sometimes it was about noticing the doors other people were still standing in front of, and deciding what you would do when you saw them. A few minutes later, an email arrived. It was not from Meridian Peak. It was from a regional energy partnership group reviewing leadership practices across several companies. They had read about the audit. They wanted Naomi to advise on a new initiative examining how professional systems identified talent. Naomi stared at the message. A year earlier, she might have seen it as another responsibility, another battle, another place where she would have to explain why fairness mattered. Now she saw something different. A choice. She closed the email without answering immediately. Tomorrow she would decide, not because she was uncertain, because she had learned that every opportunity to create change deserved the same care as every opportunity to accept it. Outside her window, the city continued moving. People entering buildings, people leaving them, people standing at doors that would either open because they were expected or remain closed until someone asked why. And this time Naomi was not waiting to be invited inside. She was helping decide what kind of doors the future would have.